Many biographies of famed architect Louis Sullivan mention his Ocean Springs, Mississippi retreat, almost as a realm into which he vanishes, disappearing completely, ceasing to exist for a time, only to return to reality in Chicago with his tightly held beliefs renewed and further entrenched. Sullivan's first biographer, Hugh Morrison, in 1935, described Sullivan's Ocean Springs house as, quote, unquote, his most loved home. How did Sullivan, a man so closely associated with Chicago's urban verticality, come to love a horizontally oriented rural retreat on the Mississippi Gulf Coast? In the late 1880s, the Chicago architecture firm of Adler and Sullivan was one of the best known in North America for their innovative, uniquely American designs that were being applied to a new building form, the skyscraper. In December of 1889, firm partner Louis Sullivan sought a reprieve after nearly 4 years of nonstop work, which included one of their biggest projects to date, the Chicago Auditorium. On this trip, Sullivan was seeking warmer climates and traveled through the West and Southwest, but did not find the respite he was searching for. Ending up on his return trip to Chicago, Sullivan found himself in New Orleans. He did not care for the city, but while there, he ran into friends from Chicago, James and Helen Charnley. The Charnleys convinced him that a trip to the Mississippi Gulf Coast might give him the respite he was in search of. After 2 weeks on the coast and feeling better rested than in years, Sullivan and the Charnleys sought to purchase land for building vacation homes. They chose adjacent parcels of land near Ocean Springs on East Beach Drive. When Sullivan saw the rural, undeveloped land, he stated he knew exactly what he would do, planning for, quote, 2 shacks 300 feet apart with stables far back, also a system of development requiring years for fulfillment, end quote. Sullivan did not use the term shacks in a derogatory sense, but rather to infer that the houses were to be private and personal in nature, not intended for entertaining or to impress the owner's lofty social status or wealth upon passers-by. While Sullivan's known for uniquely ornamental building, these cottages, both by design and circumstances, were not. The development requiring years of fulfillment that Sullivan spoke of was that of his extensive rose gardens that he would plant on the properties. This is something that the Charnleys would not undertake to the same degree as Sullivan continuously designed and redesigned his garden for the 20 years that he owned the property. In March of 1890, construction of the houses were let to a local builder, and when Sullivan and the Charnleys returned the following February of 1891, the houses were complete. They were nearly identical, both horizontally oriented with hipped roofs. They had T-shaped floor plans and were clad on roof and walls with cypress shingles. Deep porches wrapped both houses. Presumably being taken with this design for their Ocean Springs house, the Charnleys would commission Adler and Sullivan to design a year-round home for them the following year on Chicago's Gold Coast. Today known as the Charnley-Persky House, it serves as the headquarters for the Society of Architectural Historians. Louis Sullivan must have thought rather highly of the vacation homes design, as in period publications on his work, he would include his homes, which stood in stark contrast to his vertically oriented office buildings shown in the same publications. Almost immediately after Sullivan's first inspirational visit to the Mississippi Gulf Coast, his style begins to crystallize. He would shed the influence of past architects. From now on, gone is the impact, or as he would describe it, the ghost of revolutionary architects such as H. Richardson, with Sullivan leaving what he would call his quote-unquote masonry period. Evidence of this, in the summer of 1890, in the witness of others, Sullivan would design the St. Louis Wainwright building in a near 3-minute fit he described as, quote, a sudden and volcanic, end quote, giving what was immediately recognizable as a new and appropriate form to the skyscraper. On the left of the screen, you can see the Wainwright building and compare it to some New York skyscrapers by big-name East Coast firms of the era. Sullivan's design is one that expresses the verticality of the building's form as opposed to the other skyscrapers up to that point that typically expressed a horizontal in orientation, giving the appearance of multiple buildings stacked on top of one another. The design also expressed honesty in the structure's form and materials. There would be no mistaking that the building was not supported by a slender steel frame when compared with the thick, heavy walls of a load-bearing masonry building, one that a load-bearing building requires. Trips to the coast for the Charnleys and Sullivan became customary occurrences as work would allow, specifically to escape the cold, snowy weather and the hard paved surfaces of Chicago, trading them for the comparatively warmer weather and greenery of the Mississippi Gulf Coast. Sullivan would rely on his property not only to recharge his energy, but also his inspiration levels. While he avoided doing design work at the house, he is documented as doing a considerable amount of writing while in Ocean Springs, frequently using his gardening and surrounding landscape as metaphors. Sullivan's motivation to write was the defense of his work, which after 1893 began to fall out of fashion when the Chicago World's Fair ushered into vogue the White City, white plaster staffed formed buildings of neoclassical and European influence, as seen on the right side of the screen. Sullivan's contribution to the fair was a polychromatic transportation building, seen on the left of the screen. With its avoidance of classical detailing, it really was the exception to the monotone pallor of the Grand Court with its acres of classically inspired buildings. In 1895, Sullivan and business partner Dankmar Adler dissolved their firm, leaving Sullivan with more time to spend in Ocean Springs and the greater need to defend his designs after the loss of any stability that the elder Adler may have provided Sullivan with. If Sullivan could not do it his way, he would not do it at all, regardless of the client or the commission. And this attitude would become worse than whatever outside force could do to his career. The combination of the dissolved firm and a recession in the mid-1890s left Sullivan on the defensive and provided him with plenty of time to write. Of Sullivan's written works, the best known is a four-letter utterance published in March of 1896. Form ever follows function, Sullivan would say in his essay, The Tall Office Building Artistically Considered. He was questioning America's need for buildings that resemble Greek temples or medieval churches or other buildings out of antiquity. More commonly recalled today as form follows function, this is perhaps the furthest reaching seed that Sullivan germinated from his home and gardens in Ocean Springs. The Charnleys, with James suffering ill health, would sell the property to Fred and Elizabeth Norwood, also of Chicago, on June 1st of 1896. The Norwoods, like the Charnleys, had grown children and they were looking for a vacation retreat after Fred's retirement from the lumber firm of Norwood and Butterfield. Fred Norwood is often credited with introducing the double band sawmill to Mississippi's yellow pine forest in the early 1890s and creating a commercial demand for the material in Chicago and other northern markets. This company was headquartered in Norfield, Mississippi, just south of Brookhaven, and the town's name is an amalgamation of the Norwood and Butterfield firm name. On the night of February 18th, 1897, while Elizabeth was staying at their Ocean Springs vacation home with her two daughters, the house caught fire. Fortuitously, Sullivan was in residence next door at the time and was able to help them escape safely and save a few possessions. However, the home burned completely. With his neighbors dehomed, Sullivan jumped at the chance to take another opportunity to redesign a building that he was intimately familiar with, having lived in a nearly identical structure for almost 7 years, but also really viewing this as an opportunity to do something over again with the knowledge gained. For more than 100 years, we would have been able to view both a pre-form follows function and a post-form follows function execution of the same building by Sullivan side by side on the beach in Ocean Springs. The horizontal form and T-floor plan of the house, as it was reconstructed, is very similar to the building that burned. Still covered in shingles, however, the execution and the detailing of the house was further refined. The new house takes on a tripartite theme, a topic that Sullivan discussed in his essays, becoming 3 rooms wide. The house is 3 spaces deep, and doors and windows are ganged in groups of 3s. Bays were included in several rooms to increase the admission of light and ventilation, but also views from the interior. We know all too well it gets cold in South Mississippi occasionally, And the expansive views offered by the bays and gang doorways provide plenty of connection with nature while one can stay warm next to the fireplace. Fittingly, the interior wall is divided into three: a wainscot, wall panel, and frieze. Sullivan abstained from using moldings. There's no baseboard or chair rail in the house to speak of. A simple picture rail and cornice serve their purpose, but otherwise are meant to be unobtrusive. Uh, the reconstruction cost $5,000 and was likely completed in the fall of 1897, as the builder signed his name on the tongue and groove wallboards he was installing on August 5th of that year. The interior of the entire house is finished in longleaf southern yellow pine. The wall panel tongue and groove boards were a different variant referred to as curly pine, exhibiting a rare growth pattern. Norwood presumably had access to the material through his lumber business, as it appears, to a much lesser extent, however, in his business partner's home in Brookhaven. In the first iteration, before the fire, the walls had been finished in a style that most Southern homes were built during this era: pine boards clad in gauze sheeting finished with a wallpaper. Sullivan would change this in the reconstruction, choosing the curly pine material with the idea of form following function. Rather than following the Victorian era trend of elaborate paint schemes or carved woodwork, decorative plaster, or bold wallpaper, nearly nothing was done to this material, this curly pine, letting the natural grain of the wood stand out as the decoration. This also stood out sort of as the truth in materials rather than hiding the wood cladding behind wallpaper in an attempt to describe it as a flat plaster. In his book, Kindergarten Chat, Sullivan staged a young architect's education as taking place through 4 outdoor scenes. These were summer, autumn, winter, and spring, the last of which he set in a, quote, beautiful spot in the woods on the shore of Biloxi Bay, end quote, the same setting of his own home. He wrote that his efforts are to work nature's subtle spell upon the reader. His own garden is the place where Sullivan reached epiphanies on nature's influence on architecture. After 15 years of perfecting the landscape, Sullivan was ready to share his very personal retreat with the world through an architectural record article. In the article, Sullivan was described as, quote, an ardent student and lover of nature, and the Ocean Springs property as, quote, an opportunity for constant observation, inspiration, and interpretation of natural phenomena to be duly assimilated and in time to appear in concrete forms of expression as fine art in buildings, highly conventionalized ornament, or as literary productions of exquisite worth, end quote. The article concludes by asking how one could ever leave this place knowing, quote, in full measure how much it has done for our art and go out again to where its influence has spread abroad. For from this little spot has emanated the results of reflection and communication with real things, which has produced an invaluable contribution to our American architecture, end quote. Well, these homes stood side by side until the destruction of Sullivan's home by Hurricane Katrina. Sullivan's comment in his autobiography, entitled Autobiography of an Idea, published shortly before his death in 1924, was that his house was destroyed by a hurricane in 1908, a statement long taken literally, yet it was no secret that the house still stood on the corner of Holcomb Boulevard and East Beach, and Sullivan even retained ownership of the house until 1910. Speaking symbolically, however, Sullivan was referring to the destruction of his household by his whirlwind marriage to wife Margaret in 1899, which had deteriorated to the point where when Margaret traveled alone to Ocean Springs in the spring of 1908, she would end up leaving through the port of New Orleans, getting on a ship to New York, where she would live the remaining majority of her life. Sullivan viewed this once pure wellspring of inspiration as tainted. A collection of lost pains prevented him from writing much in his autobiography about his designs in Ocean Springs. While he does go on in depth about his other life experience, however, he saves his highest praise for his time spent on the coast, describing it as the place where, quote, he underwent that morphosis, which is all there is of him, end quote, and noted that he would always return with clarity of vision to Chicago. When he was in Ocean Springs, he found the clarity and resoluteness from his surroundings that allowed him to produce some of his most notable work. Referring to himself in the third person, Sullivan wrote, quote, "'Twas here Lewis did his finest and purest thinking. 'Twas here he saw the flow of life, that all life became a flowing for him, end quote. His most loyal draftsman, George Elmsley, would later say that Sullivan creates designs by communicating with the problem, far away from paper and pencil. This is the method that he urged upon all his draftsmen. And it's clear that Sullivan was getting quite far away from his pencil and paper in Chicago and doing his finest and purest thinking in Ocean Springs, Mississippi, a place that allowed him to give us our best work.